citizens' input. Did it get turned off? Okay. So Marianne, here in the in the classroom, has got something else to say.
Really quick question. I heard you say last time that,
Introduce yourself, please.
oh,
'Cause-
Marianne Plunder, Conservation Committee. You mentioned possible office hours, and I thought this was actually a good idea. Have you sort of done away with that idea?
I think well, I'll express my opinion, in response is that office hours, almost invariably tend to get wasted, with somebody volunteering their time, to sit and wait for somebody that isn't there. So to me, the process that we've talked about now, going from, the mandatory initial meeting, with the planning office, to then an introduction, and giving people the opportunity to say, yes, we'd love to talk to somebody. I think that process is going to give us the opportunity, to be more reactive, to the ones that are really interested and not spending time, waiting for somebody that isn't interested. So, is there anyone online that has raised their hand, Emily? Okay, so I'll close this item for now. And we'll move it on, to the implementation phase, with the adjustment, to the, the potential application process and the planning director's, introduction, of the process to planning staff.
There's one more.
Okay, I'll acknowledge that person without knowing who it is.
Phone number ending in 7562. You're allowed to speak.
Good evening, Caroline Verzongen. I just wanted to know what is different from this process compared to what you always had with the site visits, and then all or two of your committee members attended that meeting. I thought that was a more democratic process, and perhaps that was also a solution to talk to the architect or the applicant at the time. So I thought that was a process that was done in previous years and that it was very productive, but perhaps I'm wrong, and I would like to understand what the difference is with this process.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your question. This process is not intended to replace that. This process is, intended to provide early, free, and non-public input from the ASCC in advance of the completion of an application. The process for completing an application requires, in today's world, an enormous set of documents and an awful lot of, technical engineering and, consultant requirements to actually get to the point where your application is complete. The ASCC's desire to have, this early, informal, voluntary process, to give applicants, the feedback that we can give, to improve the, the quality of, site planning and the quality of the site planning response, early before there's a huge investment, and more reticence to make changes. Well, I'll close item 4A.
We have one more popped up.
Okay.
David Cardinal, you're allowed to speak.
Great, thanks. Quickly, I think this is a great idea. My only reticence way back when it was first started was didn't think it should be mandatory, and it's not now. So I think that's great, and I think we should do what we can to, if you will, market it as part of the process when people come into Portola Valley and start spending a lot of money on whatever their grand vision is, to make sure they understand both what is likely to be successful and how they can find out what might be successful. So I'm a big thumbs up on that. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll move on to item 4B, which is committee reports, review of, of fence permit changes for wildlife quarters, brought to us by Mary Ann Plunder. Had multiple pages. Okay, go ahead, Mary Ann.
I'm Miriam Plunder, the chair of the Conservation Committee, and this is Nona Chiarello. So first of all, thank you for putting this on the agenda. As a little bit of background, last August, Assembly Bill 1889 was written into law, and it's called the Room to Roam Bill. And that was sort of the gating factor for us getting involved more seriously in thinking about wildlife corridors, particularly if you look at the critical location of Portola Valley, which is between Windy Hill, Hawthorne, whatever is further down, what is it? Coleman Ridge, what have you, Jasper Ridge. So all around us is open space, and we are in the middle, and we need to be sure that we allow for the wildlife to be able to get from A to B. And the Assembly Bill 1889 actually will have to be implemented in the what element? In the conservation element by 2028, I believe. So it seems a long time away, but it's going to be a lot of work. And so what we decided to do, our first step was going to be obviously the low-hanging fruit. We were going to look at protecting the current wildlife corridors. And that's why we looked at the fence regulations, and that's why we put in the added wording that is the first step to protect what we've got. So my question is now, in terms of process, do you want me to go step by step through the wording of the regulations and the definition?
I'm not exactly sure. Right now, I'm trying to read what you put on our dais. Maybe you can go through that and explain.
Okay,
So
I'll explain quickly. Yeah.
The purpose beyond, AB 1889.
So I'll just go through the summary that's there. First is the wildlife connectivity element. Local governments must include a dedicated element in their general plan that specifically address wildlife connectivity. And first of all, there is the consideration for wildlife. The wildlife connectivity element must analyze connectivity areas, permeability, and natural landscape areas. Then you need to think about mitigating barriers. It must also consider and implement measures to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to wildlife movement from existing and planned land use. That's where the fences come in, obviously. Climate change, one of them, consultation, best science. Again, improved wildlife movement. The Act aims to ensure that wildlife can move across the landscape and access needed resources. And that has a lot to do with crossbreeding, that the mountain lions are not stuck on Windy Hill and get inbred because they can't get to the mountain lion lady in Jasper Ridge or what have you. And then there is obviously climate resilience, biodiversity and statewide, it's going to be a statewide policy. So that's just the executive summary of AB 1889. And you can go online and read more about it. It's just what is important from our perspective is room to roam, allowing wildlife move through the town. And then page 2 is a very rough draft, which the Conservation Committee decided to put in place in support of the fence regulation. Because a regulation sometimes is difficult to read, and it's like with the fire ordinance. The fire department has a guideline, and so it's just a supporting document so people have a better idea what it's all about. So it describes what are wildlife corridors, and I'm not going to go through the whole page. Wildlife corridors are strips of habitat that allow wildlife to safely move between large areas of habitat. These strips crisscross Portola Valley, connecting both large areas of open space, such as Windy Hill, Jasper Ridge, Stanford Dish, and smaller backyard habitat, pockets of backyard habitat and undeveloped parcels. Corridors occur along creeks and through all shapes and sizes of unfenced habitat, obviously. Roads are not wildlife corridors. They do not provide safe passage. And we have seen this sadly with our mountain lion mama, who lost her life, and with it, 3 mountain lions will be in lifelong captivity. So that's to some degree, there is actually a silver lining that this happened, because it got so much attention from our from the people in Portola Valley. And there is really, if you, Dana, you can talk about it. There seems to be a real groundswell in town to support this, to support wildlife corridors. And I think I'm not going to go through the rest. It's just supportive of the ordinance. Does that sort of bring you up to date?
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Nona, did you have, or Judith, do you want to add?
I think I'm really just here to answer questions if I can, but I mean, the basic idea is to preserve required yards where they provide passage for animals. So we're not really changing the fundamentals of the fence ordinance. We're not recommending that. There can still be, for example, perimeter fences or property line fences, but there should be a corridor that allows animals to move through a property and get to the next property or the creek or whatever it is that gets them to their eventual destination. So that's the concept behind this, is that if there is going to be a fence in what could be a wildlife corridor, it should be a wildlife friendly fence. And that means a fence that an animal can go over or go under. And those requirements for going over and under are pretty well established in the literature. So it shouldn't be higher than 40 inches, and it should have an opening at the bottom of at least 16 inches, just so that animals don't get trapped.
Okay, Judith, anything?
I'm sorry?
I was just, Judith is here. Question.
I was so disappointed that we didn't do this. I think we're very late getting to this. That being said, I think it's complicated. How do you define to the public, if they're fenced and they say, well, it's not a wildlife corridor, or, how do we execute this? And also, 16 inches, if you're trying to fence your pets in, at 16 inches, an animal can get under. So, I mean, they're just complications, but I think, in spirit, with what happened to the lions, I mean, I knew that the cubs were on Grove Drive because I knew there were no fences in there. And I knew that 3/4 of it was surrounded by creek. So it made just ineffable sense to me that that's where they were. And they could roam around. So, that's just kind of, like I said, in principle, I just don't know how we're going to craft it.
Yeah, so with the wording, with our wording, it took us, it was difficult. Yeah, we looked what we have, and we looked at sort of the minimum we would like to have added so that we protect what's open at the moment, basically. And so the wording is pretty simple, but as I said, we would have the guidelines next to it. We would be happy if you get an application in the same way as you're getting a tree application right now. The Conservation Committee is prepared to treat it the same way. You give it to us and we talk to them. We're prepared to do that work because we think it's important conservation work. And to answer your question about the dog, well, there is nothing that will stop you have a fence for the dog. It just wouldn't be a perimeter fence.
No.
So there's nothing that stops you to have an area for your dog.
Right.
Yeah.
They could be fenced in a smaller area.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. It's just the idea that if at the moment this is open and somebody wants to put in a fence, I'll give you an example. If you are in Westridge, you have your 2.5 acres and you want to put in a perimeter fence. If that is set back 20 feet everywhere, you have a corridor. So it's not, we're not asking for something extremely grandiose or difficult.
It's just defining it. I
But
think.
that's what we try.
I know.
And go ahead.
And then there are issues with areas that are very steep. We have different fencing situations for that. So, but and very steep tends to be wildlife corridor. You know, not crevasses, but, huh?
Ravine.
Yeah, ravines.
Yeah, very steep. We actually have a very good fence ordinance because you are not allowed to have anything higher than 4 feet on your hillside. If it's steep, if it's 20%. Remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I mean, I would also love to say anything about cheater fencing and people who put fabric on their fencing. So, but I mean, the cheater fences are all over the place. And some of them are 8, 9 feet high. I mean, why live here? So anyway, go ahead.
Lance?
So I just wanted to add to what Marianne said, that every property is different and we recognize that.
Yeah.
And so, we try to visualize different kinds of properties and the problems that might come up. And our best suggestion, I think, is to have guidelines that have some illustrations, so if this is the situation, this is how it might be addressed. Because it really requires some visualization, I think, to see what it means in fact.
Right. Lance?
It's a lot to try to process, but it wouldn't impact someone who has an existing fence, correct?
Correct.
And if someone was remodeling or buying and rebuilding, would it impact that yard perimeter from what they might have wanted to do?
I don't think so. The building, you have the building envelope and you have the setbacks. So I don't
Okay.
think a building, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think a building, the only thing I could think of is an ADU. But
Correct.
Okay, that is something,
And that's what we will see. As we move forward, I suspect we'll see more of that.
yeah, we will see more. That's a good point.
All right.
Great. I just read the text of, AB 1889, and it really only talks about, creating an element. It doesn't talk about ordinances. It really talks about, larger planning strategies. And I do think, you know, what would be hard to implement with, this wildlife fence, is, what the definition of a wildlife corridor is. None of the fences on my property would comply, with the current ordinance or, or this ordinance. And I know that my property is a wildlife corridor, because of the amount of wildlife and the, vast numbers, of wildlife to get through. I was on the ASCC, when, the fence ordinance, first came to light. And it was, I was here to, because I really wanted a fence ordinance, and I wanted it to be fair and, respond to the rural character, of the town. And there was an awful lot of back and forth, about what a horse fence was. And a lot of the discussion was about making sure that wildlife could get through it and over it. And I'm not sure, that, the 8 inches difference between a horse fence, and a wildlife fence, stops wildlife, because there's nobody stopping at my fence. And including, I mean, what stops most of my wildlife coming into my parts of my yard are my horses. But the wildlife are still there, between, the coyotes and the rabbits, and the turkeys and the deer. They find my front pasture to be, the most scrumptious place in town, including my fruit trees. So I think we need to, need to take this, and potentially look at where the wildlife corridors really are, because, in the districts where, the properties are less than an acre, I think that, that there isn't much, that isn't already, fenced beyond repair. And, I think trying to implement this, in those neighborhoods, would be very difficult from a human relationship standpoint, because much of those neighborhoods have setbacks of, 10 feet or 10% of the lot width, as being, the standard. So, and right now, from my position, I think our current horse fence, it actually does what this is intending to do already. And I think reducing the height to 40, to 40 inches, and making it so that there's not a dog in the world that can't crawl underneath it. And the biggest dog can go under a 16-inch hole. So I don't think that's doing anything, except, trying to legislate something that I think these, changes are really pretty unworkable, for an awful lot of people, and I think they're an overreach, because they're not related, to what AB, 1889, is actually intending to do. I think it's really intended to, to look at future developments, and existing open spaces, and seeing how humans moving into open space, would need to respect, the corridor, rather than looking at, how the open spaces are already, because we're not likely to see anything except more densification, of, kind of more internal properties. I can't support it, the way that it's, proposed. Judith?
Can I just say one quick thing? Okay, go ahead, Judy. No, the only thing I would say, we would absolutely love you for a horse fence. Of course, the horse fence would be fabulous. We just figured that maybe that would be too much to ask for a horse fence.
Well, that's what the ordinance already says.
Only
It-
only on properties over 2 acres. No. Horse
you're right.
fences are only relevant in properties over 2.5 acres in Westridge. It's not applicable in central Portola Valley, where the properties are 1 or less than 1 acre.
I- In an ideal world, living out here where we do with the animals, trying to coexist, everything would be open, except the little parcels that you need for your horse or for your dog or for your tomatoes. And I think that we were using the room to roam build as an inspiration. It's coming down the pike, and they're gonna want us to do things with the general plan, et cetera. Portola Valley has some history of trying to be ahead of the curve with reach codes and sustainability, for example, and doing things that then set models for the rest of the county and the state to follow. And that we were thinking precisely of what you said, Carter, that density is only going to increase in town. And that when you think about what happens with if one of these 5-acre lots becomes 5 1-acre lots, and there's not attention to maintaining corridors, creating corridors through there, then what's going to happen is these smaller lots are all going to have fences. And if they're not wildlife friendly or horse fences or something like that, and then we were just trying to codify what like that means, then pretty soon the animals won't be able to go anywhere except down the streets. And then you have problems with evacuation, all the deer running in the streets with the cars. And so you need wildlife corridors for other reasons. And I think property like yours is fabulous. But a lot of people, when they put up their fences now, they don't have fences like horse fencing, and they put up the kind of fences that really keep the animals out. And that's a problem. I also think we're talking about this as if it's adding a lot of restrictions. And in fact, everything we have about the setbacks and the spacing and all of that is already in the code. They're already the rules. We're just talking about what kind of a fence. We're not changing setbacks. It's a little hard to understand because it keeps talking about your yard, your required yard. And you understand what a required yard is, but most of us don't. We had to really wrestle with that. Yeah. And as the subcommittee worked on this, and we had multiple meetings over months and months, and we looked at what other states were doing, what other counties were doing, and an awful lot of the official stuff that's out there is for huge agricultural projects and properties in Montana and Wyoming, so they don't really pertain to us. We tried to hone it down so it was meaningful and realistic in our setting, in our town. And some of it has to do with a fencing that goes across a wildlife corridor. That's probably the most important piece of it that we haven't talked about yet. Is some of these corridors exist. Neighbor A has a fence setback, and neighbor B has a fence setback some, if they don't have their property line fences. And there's an area through there, and then a fence will get put across for some reason. And that those fences especially need to be wildlife friendly fences because the animals already go through there. And if a fence goes up
But
perpendicular.
nobody's going to build the whole reason for a fence is to stop something.
Right, but to stop what you want to stop and not stop everything.
Yeah, but most of what you're going to stop on those perimeters, are animals getting in or animals getting out.
Right. But
know,
so
and-
is the town,
and-
is the town concept then that no deer gets on my property because I don't want deer eating my roses? Or is that you pull your fences in so the deer can go around and you can still have your roses
Well, I
inside your?
think before you could do this, you'd have to define where the wildlife corridors are. Because, right now, only wildlife friendly fences permitted within or across existing wildlife corridors.
Well, it does have a definition. It starts with a definition. I'm going to sit down.
I don't think anyone should be able to perimeter fence, first of all.
I
I'm-
disagree 100%.
Really?
Yeah.
I think it should be pulled, I mean, you could pull in 5 feet.
Well,
There
then-
should be,
Then you're changing the relationship of property.
yeah,
The relationship is that you own it and it's yours. Yeah, and if that's the case, then that would be a taking. And the town should buy all that.
you can have a gate and you can go walk on the wildlife corridor.
Well, then it's an easement. And then you need to own it.
Yeah,
So the way it's written now is property line fences are allowed in the current fence ordinance, and nothing that we've proposed changes that. We just don't want to have a fence that say perpendicular to that property line fence between the house and the property line, if animals would normally go through that corridor or required yard, let's say. The exception would be if the whole property were fenced, and then there would be no passage possible. You know, I think that wildlife corridors can be everywhere, right? It doesn't have to be a well-defined passage where you routinely see animals. The animals adjust their passage and their movement if one corridor closes up because there's development going on the parcel. It's really important that animals can have the flexibility to go somewhere else. And so we're just really proposing that the existing open passageways stay open or have wildlife-friendly fences.
I've never seen a perpendicular fence. I
Well,
haven't
so some
seen what
people
you're talking about.
Line fence, and then they have a fence from the house to the,
From the fence to the garage,
Okay.
and from the bedroom, to the side. I mean, there's dozens of these kinds of things, because people want to keep their animals in their backyard.
And I think you're right that I think the animals go where there's no fencing. I mean, that's, like I said, how I knew that the lions were there, because there are 4 or 5 properties with no fences. Anyway,
Yeah, or they go where there is a horse fence, because that's easy to go through.
So they go where the trails are.
Yeah.
And to me, defining where the wildlife corridors are, needs to happen first. Because right now, I would see this as a taking, of my private property, as wildlife corridor. And because, it's trying to define, anything where there isn't a fence, as a wildlife corridor. And that would be my interpretation, the way that I've read, the rules that are suggested. Because, I tried to implement this, conceptually, on the various different kinds of projects that, I've done, over 1,000 projects in Portola. And some properties are inherently, geared towards it. The ones with the ravines and the deep drainages and with the creeks and, with, existing easements and existing trails. But those things make perfect sense, and they're already protected, by the current ordinance. And this to me is trying to get to, people's little side yards, where their bedrooms are up against the setback. So you couldn't end up with a fence, keep your dog in, or to close off your garbage, or, create some privacy, for the, side windows for your, I think it is. I mean,
No,
I-
that's not our intention at all.
well, then I can't support the way it's written, because I see it as a taking. Because it wouldn't work in my house. It wouldn't work in an awful lot of, my clients' places. Because it wouldn't provide the kind of normal level.
Carter, could you talk into your mic a little bit more?
Sure.
Thank you. That's a lot better.
I'll let Gina, take a crack at this.
I think that the suggestion to better define where wildlife corridors are before trying to update the code, to me, makes a lot of sense. Just from the perspective of, allowing people to feel that, all the information is out there for a given property, for instance. So if I'm purchasing a property and there are going to be additional layers of fencing restrictions on that because a wildlife corridor runs through that, I should know that. And maybe this exists and I'm ignorant to where, but I think that would be, that feels like a good step to start with, and then to work from there, because I would imagine also just that we don't really have many members of the public in attendance for this particular meeting, but I would think that people would care about this a lot, and it'd be interesting also to just hear from the public more in general.
One of the results of what happened with the Cubs was the Oakland Zoo and other people now talking about Portola Valley people understanding coexistence. And I mean, that's a pretty powerful concept, but yes, I mean, you want to fence your property line. I mean, there's nothing you can do about that. So, and then there's a double fencing, which I wish we could get on. I think we could.
Well, double fencing is prohibited.
Pardon?
Double fencing is prohibited.
Yeah, it is.
And cheater fencing is prohibited.
I know.
So these are both issues of enforcement. You know, if you want to end up, you know, if you need to solve those problems, it's already, you know, an enforcement issue. It's not a new ordinance issue. I mean, I support the concept. You know, I really do. I do believe in the wildlife corridors, but I do think it's, you know, it's a planning issue, you know, to identify, you know, where those are, you know, where the naturally occurring, you know, wildlife corridors, you know, either are or need to be defined, you know, and then, you know, you create a map, you know, as part of, you know, the update, you know, to, you know, the conservation, you know, element. This microphone is so specific.
I don't think that that there is any way or that it makes sense defining where wildlife corridors are. A wildlife corridor is everywhere where at the moment a wildlife can get through.
Well,
What it
the
is.
rats on my property go wherever they want.
That's right.
The
You have a
squirrels
wildlife
go
corridor.
they don't pay any attention to anything, and I
Right.
guarantee you that they don't care about the fences.
Right. So
And they don't need 16 inches to get in. They need about this much space. But the little finger, they'll go wherever they want.
yeah, I mean, you have the perfect situation. You have a horse fence. You are great. You're per definition, you have taken care of it. Our wording is perceived so complicated. One first step could be to look at the height, because a big issue is height. Why do people have 6-foot fences? Because they have roses and they put a 6-foot perimeter fence around the house, and then there will be no wildlife that will eat the roses. So if you start,
No, there's no deer.
Oh,
There's
there's
still-
no
there-
deer. There's still a mountain lion.
There's still plenty of wildlife. The mountain lion gets in, the coyote gets in, the turkeys get in, the rats, you know, the squirrels. There's nobody stopping, you know, I mean, if we want to define what kind of wildlife, you know, to put in the wildlife corridor, then you need to define the corridors, you know, where, you know, you're going to protect, or the places you're going to protect versus the places, you know, that are going to be, you know, open to the wildlife, you know. And I think, I mean, if the forefathers of this town, you know, had thought about it before because the reality is that most of this town was, you know, was designed and built before the town existed, you know. And you know, if this, and I do believe it was important, you know, to our founders, you know, about wildlife corridors, but, you know, they didn't ever define them, you know, and then we've kind of snuck up on it by protection of creeks and protection of ravines, you know, protection of slopes in excess of, you know, of 20%, you know. And I think that, you know, and the design of horse fences, you know, I think has gone a long ways, you know, to already answering these issues. You know, the issue of, you know, taking a wildlife corridor off somebody, you know, out of somebody's, you know, 10,000 square foot lot, I think is going to be a big deal to that person. because where is it gonna come from? In order to create that, because, got a 10,000 square foot lot or a 15,000 square foot lot or a, 20,000 square foot lot, there's not much space, to take away, from them, because on the other side of that, of that property line is another 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000, square foot lot that doesn't have much land to give. The 1 acre, the 2, the 3, the 7, the 10, the 50 acre, properties have, places to give it, but they probably are already giving it, out of the current ordinance, because of the ravines, uh, you know, slopes over 20%, and the, requirement that those properties be fenced with horse fences already.
Or 4 foot. I mean, most properties have at least 1 4 foot, usually across the front. So the animals, I mean, anything can go over 4 feet.
Right, it can go in,
Yeah.
but then potentially it can't.
Well, I
get
know fawns get
through.
stuck.
Yeah, it can't go
Um,
through. It can go in, but it can't go to the creek or whatever, yeah.
Anyway, if we're gonna, if this is a big deal, to get this done, I think that there's some more study, looking at the various property sizes. I think there needs to be a lot more study, of what is going to be defined as a wildlife corridor. Because saying it's on every property, I don't believe is true. And if every property that already has fences, is exempt, unless they're gonna tear it down, if they ever repair that fence, it's gonna be without a permit anyway. I just, we need to make sure that the rules are enforceable, because the rules right now are not even being, enforced, because the double fencing rules are not being enforced. The cheater fences are not being enforced. Creating another rule that needs to be enforced, where it's likely not to be enforced, because it's under the radar. It's that 20 feet between your house and your side yard, or your house and your backyard. I think is something that we don't have money or time to, to deal with. I think the spirit is, I'm 4 square behind the spirit. I think the Conservation Committee should step back and say, what the fence ordinance already does, and identify what it doesn't do. And if what it's trying to do is, is deal with all the little small properties, then I think you're going to have a real headache moving forward. I've been here long enough to remember when, the town, wanted to, regulate how big a basement could be, and this could be as big a bigger problem, as that, in trying to get it approved, because, I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people, showing up, to those hearings saying, what are you trying to do? And I think that this is very similar to that,
So-
because it sounds so innocent. And I think I think the innocence is there and it's intended, but I think the reality of trying to enforce it, is going to be weird, because it's going to create some weird consequences, and it'll only be for those that are willing to comply and probably would comply anyway, because the other ones aren't going to comply at all.
Would you recommend that we focus like on 1 acre and larger? Because you mentioned all the little,
Well,
would would you think that would be
Well, that's where the wildlife is mostly going anyway.
because we can do that?
Because I think the properties that are less than, 1 acre, are all, already developed. All of the, I mean, and I also think you need to think about, what the relationships are, on the multifamily properties that are going to happen, and, if you're going to define, I mean, there's some, I mean, there are a lot of things that, ordinances can't do, on housing properties. So you need to think through that. I do think that, taking a map of the town, and drawing some parameters around what you think wildlife court, what are the highest and most valuable wildlife corridors is going to be a good thing for the Conservation Committee to do. Because I do think, it'll help make, any future, conservation, of wildlife corridors easier to manage, because then they'll be defined. I mean, it's not dissimilar to defining the difference between an ephemeral stream and a creek.
And we know that that's where they are. I mean, the ephemeral streams and creeks, ravines.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, yeah, I mean, so we can certainly focus on the bigger ones. We can do the map. The one thing is we feel a sense of urgency for the larger parcels that are currently unfenced. And I'll give you an example. When you look at the previous Schornstein property, and then the parcel that had been sold off, I think it's 2.5 acres that goes to Mapache. You know what I'm talking, the Schornstein property and then the Mapache property. There is the creek between those two properties, and that Mapache property has currently no fence. That property is a clear wildlife corridor at the moment. It has complete go through to the creek, but it also has a existing corridor to the left to the house that's on Westridge, adjacent to the Mapache property and the Schornstein property. You
And
know which one?
there's a 120-foot conservation easement, between, the Mapache side and the old Shorenstein side.
That's the creek.
Well, it's more than that. It's a giant conservation.
Yeah,
easement.
there's no road. There is no road there. Yeah, that's defined.
No. It's, I think it's probably too specific right now.
Okay. Well, the point I try to make is so this property at the moment has no fence. It has wildlife going this way, and then it has wildlife going that way out to Westridge, because the Westridge property, which is not the Schornstein, it's this other one that just recently got sold, has, when they put in their fence, they set it back for a wildlife corridor. So if now people come in, they buy this property, they close off the side to that existing corridor because they can, and they close off the front, maybe a little bit further in completely because they can, there is a complete blockage to the creek. So this is just an example, but we have thought about this quite a lot.
the Shrek property. I mean, when she bought
Yeah.
the horses, but she put in a horse fence.
There's
that's
no
just
problem.
Completely open.
Yeah. A horse
So-
fence is ideal.
Yeah.
A horse fence is like open. I mean, we would very much support a horse fence
Yeah,
everywhere.
Let's, I think the the ASCC, I think, has, provided some really good, feedback, which I think was the intention. I think that, the ordinance, the way it's written, wouldn't garner my support. And I'd like to be 100% support.
Okay,
Okay?
all right. Thank you for your time.
There are public comments on this item.
So, and I would say, if you can identify some of the corridors, I know Firethorn across Alpine to Hillview, that's a corridor. The opening across from Roberts Market from the Woods Tract. That gate it's a corridor because of the fencing. So find some of the other ones, because I worry about the Corte Madera neighborhood, the Shawnee Pass people who have animals moving through that. They're using the roads now because the houses are built to the lot, the specifications. There's just not room to go between the houses. So as it's written now, it looks like less than an acre, you're going to have to provide some sort of passage facilitation between the houses. I don't know how you do that without being really disruptive and taking
Animals get stuck on Cervantes.
I understand.
And that's a rough place to get stuck. 'Cause the cars are flaming down there. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I will take public comment before I close, this item.
Rebecca Flynn, you're allowed to speak.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I originally had sort of some of the same questions that the commissioners all had about about defining what is a wildlife an existing wildlife corridor, because that's sort of how I had read the fencing ordinance originally. I thought it applied only to existing wildlife corridors. And I thought it's really going to be important to try to define the existing ones, just have a map that shows the creeks, have a map that shows the ravines, have a map that shows the large open properties that currently don't have anything fencing or only have horse fencing. I mean, I think it's important, to Gina's point, that if you're buying a property, you need to have that information in advance, that you're not going to be that we don't as a town, especially with these large properties, we don't as a town want you to put up a big old fence around your perimeter, because the property has been open for decades. So I think we want as a town to maintain that on the large properties, and those are mainly the 2 acres and above. The other thing I wanted to I love the idea, of defining where these wildlife corridors are, in order so that we can have this coexistence, so that like big animals like mountain lions and even to a certain extent deer can move through these larger areas that are not yet overly landscaped, so we want to continue to protect that. Let me think of the point. I'm trying to think of what my other point was. Oh yeah, my other point is I wanted to just use the example of the Stanford Wedge project. To me, one of the most disappointing parts of that project, and I had many disappointments, was the fact that they made these silly little backyards all fenced in. And I compare that to the Portola Valley Ranch, where people don't have fenced backyards and they are perfectly fine with having a deck, being able to look out over the mountain lion that's walking by their decks. And I think we want to encourage that for these new developments. So I would love to have this kind of wildlife fencing ordinance really apply to new projects, new developments, particularly when we're thinking about having possibly 20 units at Christ Church. We don't want closed little yards fenced in for that site. Even if there's a larger development over at Village Square, we don't want to have that property all fenced off from the creek. We want to still allow some kind of movement along that creek. So I think if the ordinance could really focus on sort of the existing situation where there aren't fences, and in the large properties where there aren't fences, where there's already large wildlife corridors, and really try to figure out how to protect those so that we can ingrain them into the particular properties that are adjacent to the creek or the ravines, then I think this would have a lot more success in terms of being able to implement it and enforce it, because somebody who's spending $8 million on a home and wants to create a little family compound where they block everyone out, and they have this huge security requirement, we can kind of make sure that they know that we don't want that, and maybe they won't buy into the town, that kind of idea. So if the ordinance could really focus on protecting what we have now, and not focus so much on the tiny little properties where it's impossible to create a big corridor. But even within the small properties, there are creeks going through that haven't been fenced off. So those are kind of things to protect. If we want to kind of focus on protecting what we have, what's open already, I think that would be the best thing, as opposed to making new requirements for people doing a small remodel or even a large remodel in an area that they've already fully landscaped and they already have some fencing. I mean, that I think is going to just cause problems. But otherwise, yeah, I think if we kind of look at the goal of protecting the open wildlife corridors that exist today, I think you'd have more success with getting this approved by everyone.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next.
David Cardone, you're allowed to speak.
Hi, yeah, first of all, I appreciate all the complexities Carter brought up. And I think from a principal point of view, I would like to see us think of fencing the same way we think of dark skies and cutting down heritage trees, in that we allow lights if they're for safety. We allow lights under certain circumstances. We allow cutting trees, and the Conservation Committee has to approve them. I'm all for, if you want to fence for your pets or your kids, great. And honestly, horse fences aren't that different than wildlife friendly fences if they're split rail, at least, so the animals can see the top of the fence, which is pretty important. So that part is fine with me. As far as wildlife corridors, you know, they're everywhere. We have a little over an acre on Golden Oak, and our driveway is a mountain lion corridor. I don't know where they're going or coming from, and they don't, but lots of people on our street get lots of mountain lion videos. And this is, I don't know, it's Golden Oak Drive. It doesn't look like it's between any two things. So I'd rather be conservative and say, if you want to put up a fence, let's be concerned. Let's figure out what the fence is for, and let's make sure it's not an awful fence, and start kind of from there. Um, to Carter's point, enforcement is a train wreck in this town for everything. And so, yes, if we want to enforce dark skies or really anything, we have to change our MO and actually enforce things, and we don't. So we can put whatever we want on the books, from what I can tell, but unless people are permit abiding, it's not going to help much. So, I mean, I can't speak to all the specific changes, but the more we can do to tell people, if you want to put up a fence, you better have a reason for it, and it better be, you know, something good. And no, you can't, I don't care how much you pay or whether Carter thinks you should be able to build a, you know, prison wall around your property. I don't, I don't think we want that. So thanks.
Thanks. Next.
Caroline Vertonghen, you're allowed to speak.
Good evening, Caroline Vertonghen. I love the idea, and I want to tell the Conservation Committee, we got the same request at the Bike, Pedestrian, and Traffic Safety Committee. We have to rethink the beautiful rural community of Portola Valley and go back to our general plan, make sure that these ideas are being enforced, because there's too many people who move here for the same for the same conservation concepts, and they lived in other places, and this is such a unique community. We have to pursue this. So BPTS, members of BPTS are ready to help you with this. It's one of the ways that if we can, you know, people, yeah, there's no oversight and people don't pay attention to the traffic signs, but perhaps if we can convince them that this is a rural community with wildlife crossings, and then again, we have to define wildlife, because yes, we have the rabbits and all the rodents, and then, but we have the beautiful deer, we have the turkeys, the wild turkeys, we have the mountain lions. And if we can convince people and educate them, I'm sure we will have the support. So this is an idea. We can work on it for the next picnic. Hopefully we will have a picnic and we will be all on board. I do have other questions. So when we moved in the town of Portola Valley, there were so many public easements, and I would like to know from the people who are on these boards and who have the knowledge and experience, who established these public easements? And is this something, who's in charge of that? That's one thing. And then, of course, my big subject, who allowed the fencing on Coleman Field paid by the town of Portola Valley? We paid $10,000 and it never went to any of the committees. Thank you so much. I would appreciate some answers. And yes, please count on the PPTS. Many people are supporting this. Thank you.
What's Coleman Field?
What's Coleman Field?
By Georgia Lane.
Excuse me?
Oh,
Co-
at the very
Coleman
end
Field
of Georgia
is,
Lane.
it's,
Oh, for the-
well, yes.
For the
It's
baseball
Put in a
field?
solid
it's-
6-foot fence. Because they
with
couldn't,
white, with,
nobody
what?
responded to them. I
nobody
know.
knew about it. It was put in and it was built as that it was a repair for the fence at Town Hall. This is Town Center. This tells you, you know, there's people in this town who could get away with things and other people have to abide by the law
Thank you,
and the
Carol.
rules.
Next. Okay,
No further comment.
thank you.
I approved a fence about a year ago on the corner of Hillside and Alpine. And
It's not,
what, oh, well, it
it's-
just had lights put on it, on each 4x4.
Okay.
Not
well,
approved.
I think that would be an enforcement action that you would want to, bring up. So I'm going to move on to our next set of items, which are several sets of minutes. And I'd like to make, one general comment about the minutes. Every set, in the public comment period, which is agenda item 2, it says Planning Commission. And if you just changed it to commission, it would work for both the Planning Commission and the ASCC. Other than that, I didn't have comments on the minutes.
Are we going to go through all the minutes?
You can go. Did you want to just submit, a written report, and or did you want to?
The only thing I had trouble was, and you weren't there, it was the Priory meeting. And we did talk about the CUP, the planning department, but I think ASCC I was chairing the meeting and I was reluctant that night because we were not aware of the CUP, of the updating of it. And I just didn't feel like that came through clearly in the minutes. Anyway, you just might take a look at that. And also on page 10 of that, Betsy Morgan Taylor is Betsy Morgan Taylor.
Lance?
I have nothing to add. I'm fine.
Jana? I entertain a motion, to approve all 5 sets. One roll call vote, with taking into account the Dan has comments.
I would
Yes,
second that. Oh, or Lance.
Go ahead, Gina.
She's seconding your motion.
I would amend December. I was not on the committee at that time, so I'll either abstain or not vote on
Okay,
that.
let's pull that one off and we'll do the other 4. Okay?
Yes.
Roll call vote,
Chair Ward,
yes.
Commissioner Breen,
Yes.
Commissioner Dixon,
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn,
Yes.
Okay,
4-0.
let's move back, to 5A, the meeting of December, dealing with the Priory project. I was not in attendance, so I'll be abstaining, and Lance will be too, because he wasn't a member yet.
two commissioners does not does not pass a motion.
But abstentions go with a majority.
Okay.
So we're still here and we're still voting. So is there a motion to approve, the December meeting dealing with the Priory?
I'll introduce a motion to approve.
Okay,
I'll second.
all in favor?
Roll call.
Roll call.
Chair War,
I abstain.
Commissioner Breen,
Yes.
Commissioner Dixon,
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn.
I abstain.
Motion carries.
Motion passes 4-2 and an abstention.
Two
Two and two.
Two and two.
2 and 2.
And the abstentions go with the majority. Okay. Any other committee reports?
Gina and I have been finishing up Westridge, what's 857? Is that the address? Just that new house that the neighbors were having issues with the fencing and the tennis court. Remember that one?
Yes.
And so we went up there and just wrote another report. The invasive plants haven't been handled. The fencing has been handled. And that's about it, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
Any other business? Hearing none. Meeting is adjourned at 7:38.